hello, everybody. Welcome. On behalf of Mongabay, I'd like to thank you so much for joining us on this webinar on an incredibly important topic that we're really excited to discuss with you today, agroecology and how to report on it. So as many of you likely know, agroecology is a way of growing the food that we eat that draws upon indigenous knowledge of food and food systems and working with nature rather than extracting from or exploiting it. So today on this panel, we're going to be talking more about that in depth and giving you important context and story ideas. And additionally, we'll have about 10 to 15 minutes of questions at the end that you will be able to pose. So please save them for that time. So first, I'd like to introduce our panel, starting with Anna Lappé. She is a best-selling author and an internationally recognized food expert and funder in support of food systems as well. You may know her as the author of Diet for a Hot Planet and contributor to the 50th anniversary edition of Diet for a Small Planet. And Anna is the founder or co-founder of 3 national organizations, including Real Food Media. So Anna, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
And next is Regi Haslett-Marroquín. He is an owner and founder of Regeneration Farms, LLC, and the founder and president of the Regenerative Agriculture Alliance. And he has also served as a consultant for the United Nations Development Program's Bureau for Latin America, and as an advisor to the World Council of Indigenous Peoples. So Regi, it's an honor to have you here today.
Great to be here.
And lastly, we have Thomas Cherico Wanger. He is an associate professor at Westlake University in China and the principal investigator of the Sustainability, Agriculture, and Technology Laboratory. Thomas, great to have you.
Well, thanks for having me here. And great to speak on this panel.
And I am Mike DiGirolamo. I am the Audience Engagement Associate at Mongabay. So without further ado, let's get into it. So the first question I have for all of you today is, can you describe how you would explain agroecology to someone who has never heard of it before? And can you explain how you would recommend a writer explains it to a reader who also may not be familiar with it? Any one of you can chime in.
Well, I can jump in first. we're all, for those of you listening and watching, we're all looking at each other to see who would go first. So hi, welcome. I am Anna Lappé, and we were told with our answers to these questions to keep them short, but of course the story of agroecology is a long and complex and big one. But to keep it short, you already heard a little bit at the top of the webinar about the headline message about agroecology, which is the marrying of agriculture and ecology, as you could hear in the term itself. And it's a vision for a real redesign of our food system from seed to plate to ensure that there is economic sustainability, social sustainability, and environmental sustainability embedded into our food systems, what we don't have today. And so you heard a little bit already that it is about using nature as opposed to exploiting nature when we produce food. But importantly for me, the concept of agroecology is particularly powerful because it holds 3 things all together. It holds the science of that practice of what that work is. It also holds the doing. What do food producers do on the land when they deploy agroecological practices? But just as importantly, it includes this 3rd component, which is movements. It is fundamentally for those agroecology advocates and understanding that if we are going to change food systems, we have to talk about power, who holds it, and how that power needs to shift so that food producers and everyday people who eat, that is everyone on the planet, that they have a place at the center of our food systems, not those private interests who profit from chemicals and fertilizers and the other inputs that go into chemical agriculture. So those are my kind of headline points, but you asked, how do journalists tell what is agroecology? I think like all of you writers out there, you do that through story. And so I can come to some stories later, but I think it's both helping people understand these big concepts and doing that through telling the story of people who are bringing those concepts to life.
Wow, that's so awesome. Thank you, Anna, for opening that up and for stepping forward. I'll just follow that by saying, yes, I totally agree that ownership, control, and governance of the systems is what actually ultimately defines what happens on the land, what happens to people, to animals, and to everything that we call agriculture. Now, from an agroecology, the marrying of those 2 terms, let's remember that agriculture, we understand it as a process for primarily what we say producing food. Now, from the original concept and the root of where these concepts have emerged from, I call it a subsection or a sub-concept of indigenous agriculture. Indigenous agriculture being a concept by which we don't understand this process of engaging the ecology for the purpose of generating food, but rather where we engage the natural biophysical and chemical processes that through geoevolutionary processes and time, we're perfected to transform energy from non-edible into edible forms. And those edible forms or expressions of energy is what we get to harvest. And that cannot be done unless we engage from within the biophysical and chemical processes that define the multitudes of millions of ecologies across the earth that combine form the ecosphere, which is the only limit at which agroecological concepts, and especially the original source of those concepts, which is indigenous ways of thinking and being, have a limit. So that is fundamentally what we are talking about. This is not about agriculture and ecology. This is about how the ecology, through its processes that evolved over millions and billions of years, delivers us what we call food, but food being just simply an expression of energy and a molecular level of organizing that allows us to harvest it as food. But remember that before we can harvest that output from the ecology through the agro practices, that food that we are harvesting has been food already to trillions of other living systems, and that is the concept of the ecological aspect of agriculture.
Those were two great answers, and Thomas, I don't mean to move on to the next question here, but I do want to make sure that we go ahead and breach this next question here. So given that context, what are some of the most consequential topics or issues currently that have direct relation to agroecology, such as public health, social equity, food security? And in which of these contexts do you think that agroecology needs to be covered more in the media?
I would like to add one more point to the previous question super quickly.
Sure, go ahead.
And welcome everybody again. I'm Thomas Cherico Wanger. I think it came out clearly that there's a plethora of aspects that are very important for agroecology, and I think there's quite a bit of discussion of what agroecology really is. So I think for what we are discussing, I think it's quite useful to also specify that potentially there's kind of some definitions, some frameworks of what that concept really is. And I would like to refer here to the high-level panel of experts from the FAO, from the document from 2019, which provides such a framework of how we can discuss this. Now, coming back, Mike, to your question, I think we had coming up this biodiversity summit very recently, and we're having the COP26 coming up, so related to biodiversity and climate change. And I think agroecology, this very dynamic and integrated concept, offers great way of addressing some of the climate challenges that we are facing and mitigating biodiversity impacts. When we think of systems, agroforestry systems, for example, when we think in general, more general terms of diversified, very diverse agricultural systems. So I think these 2 points have been covered in the media to some extent very well. What I do think needs to be covered a lot more is, and that is what Anna and Regi pointed out, is this social component, this component that relates to the farmers and all these positive stories of how agroecology, how agroforestry touches millions of smallholder farmers and how that can actually change lives of people. And I think this is actually where a huge opportunity lies for journalists to tell these kind of stories of how, in particular in the transition, right? We are at a point in time where we really need to transition from more conventional systems towards these agroecological systems. And I think telling these stories, these success stories of people. I think this is where a huge opportunity lies for journalists and for the media in general.
That's great. Does anyone else have any other points on that question to add?
I'll say all of the above, definitely. We do need to cover, again, to repeat that, the structures that define how all of these issues are influenced, how decisions are made, and ultimately how they are solved. And this means paying attention at the ownership, control, and governance of land, natural resources, the supply chain infrastructure especially. And it is at this level where all of these decisions are made, where investments are prioritized, where structures are built to perpetrate and condition what ultimately happens with all of the issues associated with practices, transactions, and patterns of extraction and exploitation that at the end define public health, social equity, food security, and climate change. So you start in the opposite side, in fact, not by looking at those issues, but by looking at the root causes of those issues, and then so literally follow the money.
Yeah, and I would just add, I loved everything you both said. And what I would add to the kind of top line messaging that I feel is missing is that I think so much of the reporting, to the extent that anyone is reporting on agroecology and the movements for agroecology, that still I feel that often it gets framed as a kind of fringe issue, or it's kind of nested within other issues, as opposed to what I think the evidence is now telling us, which is that if we are going to have a functioning planet in the next century, we have to transform food systems fundamentally, and agroecology is a pathway to get there. And so I think there is actually a lacking of a really high level storyline about the urgency, you know, that 37% of greenhouse gas emissions come from our food sector, that pesticides and monoculture agriculture are driving insect collapse that could be apocalyptic. You know, these very, very clear messages about the need for systems change. And I think reporting can do a better job of really elevating the urgency of this and not making it sound like these are some, you know, radical fringe people talking about this issue.
Great point. Great answers all. So given this, what do you feel, or what are you seeing are some of the biggest policy barriers to implementing agroecology?
You jumped all the way to the bottom.
No, this one's number 3 or 4.
But yeah, no, I get some notes here. Let me just go through this quickly. You know, actually, I went into the policy instances where we are actually advancing forward. But I think the barriers right now are this insistence, primarily the insistence on financing and propping up the very systems that are destroying the very ecology on which we depend to feed the world going forward. I mean, you can start from there, and then this whole tree of policies emerge from there, all the way from how we subsidize corn production to how we subsidize animal factories, to have subsidized the super rich. Just look at what happened during the pandemic at the food companies. You know, one company alone getting over $2 billion to you know, as part of their COVID recovery packages. I mean, seriously, that is just an excuse to prop up a system that is destroying the planet in the name of feeding the world. So that's the biggest, you know, umbrella barrier that then defines all of these other specific policies that simply connect back to that trunk, that insistence of not letting go of an obsolete system that is verifiably the very system that is destroying our ability to feed the world.
I would like to actually add on something that that Anna said, and basically, you know, we have to move agroecology out of that niche. You know, that it's kind of something potentially radical thinking that you know, is the side issue, but it can actually be very transformative. And I think in that sense, adding on to what Regi said, I think the issue is also very much knowledge based. So we're talking a lot about, you know, environmental issues and social issues, which forces then the policymakers to actually make a change, make a transition. But at the same time, there's a lot of back and forth in talking about it rather than doing something. And I think you know, this kind of puts everything on a lock-in mode. And the other thing, knowledge related, I do think is about recent technologies, for example. So we are talking about, when we talk about biotechnology, for example, there's a very polarized view on biotechnology in certain fields. But when you look at technologies such as gene editing, for example, which can provide very useful tools to make food systems more sustainable, I don't think it's only about discussing the technology, but it's also about discussing collaborations and understanding how we can make these technologies useful for the farmers, how we can empower farmers to use these technologies, to understand these technologies. And we have just actually published a paper on this aspect. So how can CRISPR-Cas varieties in tree crops, cocoa and coffee, and also citrus, for example, how can this be made useful and available to smallholder farmers? And I think we as agroecologists, we do have the tools to do it. We can provide advice on how to do agroforestry systems. We can come up with tree nursery approaches. We can provide so much guidance to farmers, and we can actually engage in a dialogue. And that knowledge that the scientists have, they need to be included much more in this farmer engagement, and I also think in policy advisory. And we need to make sure that we understand how we can feed the knowledge into these farmer networks and into these farmer to farmer knowledge transfer networks.
And if I can just jump in on this policy question, I think I mentioned earlier that all good journalists know that using story to communicate is essential. And I think also good investigative journalists know to follow the money. So you've heard folks already talking about this. And I think that is really critical, because the policy we see is more often than not a reflection of powerful interests, powerful corporate interests. And when you're talking about this transformation shift to agroecology, you're talking about a threat to some very powerful industries. I was just looking at the current projections of just 4 sectors of industrial agriculture: pesticide industry, the fertilizer industry, and 2 commodities, just palm oil and beef. Together, just those 4 industries are predicted to be a $750 billion market in the next 5 or 6 years. So think about the kind of economic heft to really shape what policy looks like. And I think what we need from the media is really good reporters looking at how those industries are inflicting their interests on the policies that we have, and how can we have policy making that really reflects all of our interests in having a stable climate, having biodiversity, having well-fed people.
And actually, that's a great segue into the next question that I want to bring up is, what are some of the biggest challenges that you think then journalists face when covering agroecology? And what is your advice to help overcome those challenges?
I can jump in first here. I mean, I think that in some ways that the challenge that journalists face covering agroecology is the challenge that journalists face covering any good issue these days, which is a challenge to media, institutions, and resources for journalists. But setting that aside, I think that a big challenge for folks who want to cover these issues, again, sort of, I'm repeating myself here, but it ties back to those interests. So one of my areas of research over the last decade or so has been looking at how the food industry has been using public relations and kind of stealth spin tactics to shape the narratives that we hear often in the media about food and farming and sustainability. And unfortunately, we have seen journalists who haven't kind of dug beneath a study or dug beneath an organization reporting on some of these stealth tactics as if they are sources of information we should trust. So what I mean by that is the money that pesticide companies have spent on creating nonprofit front groups that might sound like they're, the working for the farmer or working for everyday folks, but actually they're funded by the pesticide industry. And sometimes journalists report on those organizations as if they are actually not tied to industry. There was a group that was formed by pesticide companies throughout the EU when the EU regulators were looking at whether or not they should restate the ability for EU countries to continue to use the herbicide glyphosate. And a network called Freedom to Farm was started. And on the surface, it looked like farmers all across the EU saying, we need to keep glyphosate on the market in order to keep farming. And it turned out that actually it was an effort funded by the public relations firms for the chemical companies that were trying to keep pesticides on the market. And thankfully, there were some journalists who broke that story and covered it. And that's the kind of journalism that we need. And that's one of the barriers that all of us who are trying to tell the story of what's really happening out there need to be clear-eyed about, that billions are being spent every year to shape the story that we're all hearing. And how can we as communicators, again, get beneath that spin to tell the real story?
I think I see some other challenges. So for example, moving away from sensationalism is very hard, primarily because these are complex issues that they cannot be communicated in sound bites. And that's a challenge, definitely for writers and journalists. We as humans also thrive on negative scenarios, on negative information. Good news don't really excite the public. And that's another big challenge that has to be overcome in the context of communicating something hopeful and something that actually has so much potential, like agroecology. We also depend on paradigm shifts to implement agroecology at the scale we need to. And paradigm shifts are not exactly something that journalists are going to cause. I mean, it could happen. And I have theorized. I mean, I'm not a journalist. I written a book and I wrote a second one, but not from the perspective of journalism. And so the paradigm shift, I think, is what we need, and yet that's a challenge for journalists to achieve. Now, to your second part of your question, what do we suggest? I think that one of the most important aspects of this this area is for journalists, for everybody in this conversation across the globe, to think not as individuals. This is an ancestral way of organizing, by the way. This comes from indigenous organizing and governing systems, where you see the success not as a result of what you do, but rather your success as a result of the collective, or what you do collectively. And that is the foundation of movement building. Nobody leads a movement. A movement builds on the foundation of organizing structure and stuff like that. And so what we really need is a movement of journalists, not a agreement among journalists to cover an issue, because that goes up and then drops and dies. So I would say join up, collude, please collude with each other so you can standardize language, organize as a sector globally, expand to global proportions, become unavoidable. Stop competing for our audiences, stop using colonizing language, radicalize and seek large-scale impact by aggregating your language, your media infrastructure, all of the systems you have in place for the purpose of targeting messaging to single places where the most damage is coming from, because you can do that. Those of us in the field, we have to produce the more, we have to survive on producing or harvesting energy in the form of food and marketing it and all of that. So we don't have the time to actually strategize how to organize messaging. We depend on you who know how to tell the stories. Anna is one of the, my heroes in terms of storytelling. And I come from a storytelling culture, so that is really valuable. And yet, storytelling is still the most powerful way of affecting paradigm shift. And if you are able to create a story of your collective effort on how you align in order to shift this narrative, then you will be part of that story of change. Otherwise, you're going to be faced with this challenge with no tools to deal with.
If I can add to these great points, I think agroecology is a very broad term, and oftentimes you hear people talk about organic agriculture, regenerative agriculture, agroforestry systems, diversification of agricultural systems, and so to some people in the audience here, all these terms might sound either very similar or very confusing. So I do think when we discuss these issues, when we cover these issues from a more scientific point of view, or just to have the language right here, as you said, I do think it's important that we have some common language that what we're talking about. And I can just stress that point, that I do think that the high-level panel of expert document what the FAO put out in 2019 is extremely helpful here, because it encompasses all these different aspects that are included in what agroecology and other innovative ways of food production are, and how that can assist the food systems transition, and also in general the change of agricultural systems. So to me, having a good understanding of the concept per se, and something that we all agree on, and not trying to move bits and pieces here and there, also adds on to really making that change, making that difference that is absolutely urgently needed in this point in time.
Those are all great points. And I do want to circle back to a question that I didn't ask earlier, but this is kind of piggybacking on everything you've mentioned here. What then are some innovative success stories you've seen so far using agroecology from a practitioner standpoint, or really just any story ideas that you could give to the audience here to help them cover agroecology?
I'll post two of them. My favorites. The first one is the Maya Mountain Research Farm in Belize. Is a tropical version of a system that can be applied anywhere tropical forests thrive. The second one is the Pasticustores del Desierto in Mexico. This is not a little farm in the corner of Northfield, Minnesota. These are thousands of acres managed in a way that are actually totally regenerating that landscape at a scale that nobody thought it was actually possible. And of course, I have literally hundreds of them. You can check them out at regenerationinternational.org. I'm founder of Regeneration International, and also we have collected a very extensive, I can't remember if it's on the 300 or 400 key projects like Maya Mountain and Pasticultores, and trying to aggregate all of this agroecological, agroforestry, regenerative, sustainable offshoots of indigenous concepts.
Yeah, and if I would just add too, I think, as you're saying, that there are so many stories out there. And I think this goes to one of the biggest myths about agroecology, that again, it's fringe, it's small scale. And what I really sense from the stories that I've seen around the world is that it can scale, but it doesn't scale the way industrial agriculture does, which is thousands and thousands of acres that look the same of a monoculture. It scales people to people, village to village, and we are seeing that around the world. But I'll put some resources in the chat that come to mind that folks might find helpful. But I also just wanted to share in 1 minute, paint a picture of what this actually looks like. And it's a story that I think about a lot, because it comes to mind when I picture what does it look like when agroecology works on the land. And it's a story from a farm in the middle of the United States, not what you might think of as the center of booming agroecology. And it's a story of visiting a farmer in central Wisconsin who was using agroecological principles. And I visited this farm right after right after a devastating flood event, very much climate change induced catastrophic flooding had hit the state. And I show up at this farm. It is surrounded by acre upon acre of row crop corn growers. And I looked out across all of this farmers and neighbors' land, and there was basically not a corn stalk standing. This land had been completely uncared for. The soils were dead. So when the water hit, gullies of soil were dug out of the farms. The farms were all devastated around him. His farm, it was almost better than ever. It was lush and thriving. And he showed me all the different ways that his agroecological choices had protected the farm from this weather event. So all of the work he'd done to create healthy soil meant his soil was like a sponge that held on to the water. So when the rains came, there had a place to go on the land and not wash away. He showed me the agroforestry he was doing, and the shrubs he was growing had created cover so that when the heavy rains fell, it didn't destroy the crops that were below them. And again, all of these different ecological practices that he'd pulled from eons and eons of understanding of ecological principles to protect the land. And it was, one of many moments I've had, and anybody who's done any research on agroecological farms, I think would share that this incredible sense of the vibrancy of nature when you work with nature, as opposed to try to control it and destroy it with chemicals and with synthetic fertilizers. So there are so many stories, and again, we'll put links here in the chat, but if you go to Regeneration International, you'll find them, and there are many other stories. And these are the stories that would be so wonderful to have echoed out across media.
Okay, maybe I can also share something. So we have I could add to the list of these small initiatives that that I think are fantastic, but I do think they're actually very hard to find. So I will also post some links here later on. So that's a great resource. I do find I have to say these independent dialogues of the United Nations Food Systems Summit very remarkable. When you look at some of these initiatives, you have funding opportunities for forest friendly agriculture. You have good food practices in Bulgaria. We recently posted our upcoming independent summit on enhancing and understanding how we can transfer knowledge to rice and vanilla farmers in Madagascar. So I think this forms a great additional platform that I think is fairly easy to access, and where you can find interesting resources of where projects are doing something useful, and you can, as investigative journalists, you can look into these projects more and see what is sensational and what is looking for sensations, and what is just and what is actually really making a difference. So I think these are also sources for great stories.
I'd like to add something quick there about scalability, because I think Anna brought up this whole concept is so misunderstood in general. For example, I work from a completely indigenous perspective, all the way from engineering, from organizing, governance, ownership, control. All of that is done from the collective to ensure or de-risk and minimize the risks for the individual. And so we get people here who write about what we do. Yet they come to my farm, or they go to another farm, and they write about the farm. They don't see the collective. And we don't scale. So if you look at one of our farms, it may be 20 acres. And that just simply doesn't tell the story of scalability, because we don't see scalability as in building big companies or in building big farms. I gave you those examples because I kind of unconsciously play to the normal tendency to think that a farm has to be thousands of acres for it to be considered scale. And yet, if you look at our region here, there's over 20 of us now. We control almost $30 million worth of property, plant, and equipment. And that story doesn't come out because the journalists, the people coming over to look at us, they refuse to see the story of the collective, which is the way we understand and we plan and execute scalable systems, not farms, not operations, not corporations, not NGOs. We see the collectivity as the way to scalability. But if that collective doesn't show up in the story, then we miss the whole point. And that's why we tend to think that this stuff, this work we do is in the fringes, because we go to my farm. And yes, I'm in the fringes as a farmer, but I am not the system. The system is much greater than us. And by the way, we are highly organized, we are systemic, we are methodical, and we are incredibly professional business-wise, management-wise, and completely scientifically verifiable. So this is what we are talking about here, not something out there on the corners, or not something that we cannot take over the world with. In fact, the only limit to what we're doing is the ecosphere itself. That's the only limit we got. That's the scale at which we can operate. But don't expect a company that is going to be operating at a global level from us. That's not how we operate.
All right. So on that note, you've already been sort of answering this as we go, but I just want to go ahead and breach this topic about myths and misinformation. And you've already mentioned some of these, but what are some of the biggest common myths that are being spread right now? And what are some of the bigger points of misinformation in agroecology that journalists can ensure they are effectively addressing?
I'll start to say that I think one of the big myths that I've been investigating how it continues to circulate and propagate are the messages and the narrative that we hear that we need pesticides to feed the world, and that pesticides aren't really that bad for us. They're not really that toxic. And as I've been digging into this narrative, it's been really clear to me that there's a pretty dominant public understanding that the fossil fuel industry knew for decades that fossil fuels would lead to this climate crisis, and they use doubt and denial tactics to really suppress that knowledge. We know the tobacco industry, same thing. They knew for decades that tobacco caused cancer, and they use doubt and denial tactics to suppress that understanding. And what we're seeing now is that the chemical companies, it is the same story. And it's not just that they're using big oil and big tobacco's playbook. These chemical companies help to write the public relations playbook. And in that playbook, it is using tactics very much like tobacco and big oil, using tactics where they have gone after scientists who have raised fundamental questions for decades about the toxicity of pesticides and tried to defame them. Back on my bookshelf, I have Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. When that book came out in 1962, Monsanto hired a team of public relations folks to try to defame her, to destroy her reputation, to say that she was, unscientific and totally off base. Well, of course, we knew she was completely right. And so I think there is this really deliberate attempt to try to, again, marginalize the story of needing to rapidly decrease the use of pesticides globally is just one example. We now know, thanks to a study that just came out in December, the first to adequately assess the toxic impacts, the acute toxic impacts of pesticides on those working with pesticides around the world. That study found that 44% of people around the world using pesticides as pesticide applicators or on farms have an acute pesticide poisoning event at least once a year. 44%, nearly half. I mean, that is so shocking. And of course, if you have an acute pesticide a poisoning incident, it is likely to lead to long-term implications for your health. So I think that one of the biggest messages that we need to contend with is this fundamental narrative about what role do pesticides play? Do they even play a role in helping feed us? And how that message has been developed over decades by a chemical industry that has obviously a very vested interest in continuing to push pesticides around the world.
Wow, that is, I'm learning so much today. Thank you. One thing I have struggled with, a myth I struggle with, is this idea that you need corporations and large-scale agrochemical and confinement animal and monocultures to feed the world. In fact, the facts show, and this has been extensively researched, that the world is actually fed upwards of 70% of the total food that we eat in the world is produced by around 500 to 700 million farmers operating on under 25 acres. That is a fact. Now, that's a myth that we need this conglomerate food systems. That's very effective, not at producing and distributing food. Is very effective at extracting value from people in the environment and the economy and consumers and the government through the subsidies. That is what it does. It is not designed to feed the world. That's a very large lie and myth that we have come to now embrace. The other thing is that now we're coming into this whole, halo balloon of carbon markets and just moving us in a whole nother rabbit hole. carbon markets and the way we are portraying them as a solution stuff is so myopic and so reductionist that actually just adds a tremendous amount of confusion to these solutions that are actually populating and solving the real problems we need. Nature doesn't operate like that. Nature operates in holistic ways, circular ways. And yes, carbon is a huge part of it. Carbon shouldn't be in the atmosphere. It should be in living tissue, in living systems. It should be in the form of carrots and chickens and eggs and cows and all of that. The other big myth is that we produce a lot of food and that the world produces a lot of food because we have confinement animal production and monocultures. It's completely contrary to the truth. For example, in our case, we developed and tested, prototyped and super tested, perfected, in fact, a production system for poultry that allows us to do this at any scale we want. We even calculated how many production units and acreage and farmers and workers and investments and all of that we would need to deploy this poultry system by restoring poultry to its natural environment, jungle-like environments, restructuring the local ecologies with native species and all of that. And while doing all of that, I also calculated that it will take about Minnesota's and half of Iowa's total landscape to feed the world at 10 billion in 2050, while restoring all the water systems, all of the ecological infrastructure on the land, native species, and carbon to the soil and all of those things, and feeding the world completely from our agroecological regenerative system all the way through 2050. That in the same space where we now produce single crops by 95% of the total landscape, 40% of the Midwest is actually plowed under and turned into an ecological desert through corn and soybeans. Michael Pollan said in one of his publications that corn and soybeans do to the land the same thing as asphalt does to the land in the context of biological diversity and ecosystems disasters. Now, those are huge myths that we now can continually perpetuate by the way we approach the messaging behind this. Beef, for example, we could produce more beef in the Midwest than we can produce right now through grass-fed systems, agroecological designs, and we can produce with confinement in the whole Midwest all the way down to Missouri and some of the outlying states beyond the 12 central states. And we could be restoring all of this ecology, and especially the human connection that comes with this kind of ecological systems, the economical ripple effects. I mean, we're not just talking about single products, we're talking about multi-layered stacking of enterprises instead of just this single extractive process. So those are all layers and layers of myths, of facts within myths we have come to believe that we definitely have to dispel, and we have to start moving away from replicating and reinstating. So
we've mentioned a few resources here in this webinar so far, but I did want to go ahead and ask you all, what are some resources or organizations or individuals that you all think are doing important work that a journalist may be able to go to for information or questions? Are there any particular institutions that you trust that you want people to know about in specific?
Yeah, go to Tim Lassell, Chico State University. Go to Andre Liu, formerly with I4M. Go to Anna Lappé. She's a walking library of resources like this. I don't think we can post them all in here, but I mean, I am not one of your resources. I can only give you arguments and facts and data and good stories from the land. If you need that, come here. We'll be happy to take you on 2-3 days tours of the region and show you how important this is. Also, Regeneration International has a really vast network of professionals and verifiable, credible resources for you to go to and get in touch. I mean, I can probably just download quite a few more. I was just not thinking about this right this moment.
Those are, oh, go ahead, Thomas. So those are all great. I would just, in addition to those, there were 6 that I would lift up, and I'll drop the links into the chat for there's a couple of think tanks that I really rely on that are doing some really great research on international trade and agriculture issues. Policy group in the US called the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy is great. On the global scale, a relatively new, founded in 2015 organization that I find has been producing really great work is called IPES Food. It stands for the International Panel of Experts on Sustainable Food Systems. And I'll drop these into the link. A great group that's been really looking at corporate consolidation across the food system and has great research and reporting is ETC Group. Again, I'll put their link there. An academic, there's a lot of great academic departments. This has been one of the things we've really been excited to see, just how much agroecology has entered into academia and that research component. One of those institutes that I think is doing really great work is called the Center for Agroecology, Water and Resilience. It's based out of the UK. Again, I'll put this in the chat. And then I mentioned this, one of you asked about, sources for great stories. And I mentioned that I am working with some funders who are trying to support agroecology on the ground. And those funder networks, actually, I see as a great place to go to see some really exciting work that's happening all around the world. So those two networks, I put their links in the chat and I'll put them in again right now. One is called the Agroecology Fund, and the other is called the Global Alliance for the Future of Food. And the Global Alliance just produced, and they just did a second edition of it, something called Beacons of Hope, that are stories of work all around the world. And so those are all things I would recommend, places I'd recommend to go. And I'll drop them into the chat now. And then someone in the Q&A asked about the study I mentioned, that pesticide poisoning study. And so I put that into the Q&A for those who want to read that study. It will blow your mind and really upset you, I hope and think. And I'll drop these other links into the chat.
Yeah, maybe just a couple of resources to add. I think an important resource or an interesting resource is probably Miguel Altieri's lab at UC Berkeley, where you can get a lot of very insightful information about agroecology, very scientific. I think Food Tank, that's an important think tank. They're pushing for food system changes. You get important insights and overviews. And I also think the Agroecology Learning Alliance in Southeast Asia, so ALI-C, they've also collated a lot of information about agroecology, especially in Southeast Asia. And I do think that the World Agroforestry Center is also providing some very useful information of what's going on in the agroforestry sector, for example. And if I can be of help for anything related to agroforestry, agroecology, please also feel free to reach out.
Great. So there is another question that this was brought to my attention before I compiled this large list of questions that I had here. Someone brought up to me about big food labels or conglomerates co-opting agroecology and thereby greenwashing their practices. Have you all had any experience looking into this, or do you know anything about it? What can you tell our viewers about this?
I have had to deal with quite a lot of that, especially because, again, I operate from my original teachings in Guatemala from elders, and it is really disheartening to watch just pieces of the stuff we were taught, holistic approaches to management, pieces of that being appropriated, named, and then extracted upon for the purpose of propping up either brands or companies that are having trouble with their public images. And so regenerative, sustainable, agroecology, agroforestry, these are all offshoots of that original full package. It's like having this massive source of wisdom and knowledge, and then just taking what makes sense for a specific situation. So yes, I've been writing about decolonization and indigenization of methodology, language, and science, and doing it in response in one way to, in certain way, to this real large scale colonization going on by, the corporate nonprofit world and the corporate world that have just come out and just overloaded this space with some very reductionist ways of with almost complete lack of understanding of what it means for something that is regenerative rather than being named regenerative or called regenerative. In other words, what we have said to equip people to look at this with clarity of mind is that you can't label something regenerative. You can't call it regenerative. You are not necessarily delivering regeneration unless you are. My point being that something is either regenerative from an indigenous perspective of understanding life cycles and energy flows and all of that, or is not. Just because you call it, it doesn't make it so. And so separating that from a journalistic perspective is critical, because regeneration doesn't happen, one, at a product level. There is no such a thing as a regenerative chicken or egg or carrot or cow. Such a thing doesn't exist. There is not a regenerative farm either. Farms can't not regenerate on their own. There is the only place where regeneration starts to materialize is at an ecosystem level. In ecosystems, we could be talking about, say, all the migratory routes of the migratory birds throughout the Midwest, from the South all the way through to Canada. That level, that is at the level that regeneration actually happens. And so we will not arrive there unless we understand the fundamentals of what we are talking about. And this appropriation and whitewashing of such a massive promise that the indigenous and ancestral knowledge and wisdom are delivering to us, we're squandering that opportunity when we miscommunicate what it means to deliver a regenerative design to the landscape and to the people. So I would say from that perspective, keep that in mind, because we're colonizing this space. Some folks came in, named it, just like Christopher Columbus, appropriated it. Once they named it regenerative or whatever, appropriated it, then they modify it and develop structures for certification and other kinds of schemes so they could extract more value out of nature and the people out of it, but never considered the fact that the ownership, control, governance, and all of that was left intact, because that is foundationally, that is the foundational structure of extraction. The extractive system were never touched, and nobody wants to touch that, no matter how much they fill their pages with regenerative, so-called regenerative. And so these are things, we got to spell that out, and we got to bring it back. And remember, our true indigenous, agroecological, if agroecology is going to be reflective of the true indigenous concept, is not a set of practices, is not a farm, is not a product. It's a way of thinking, it's a way of living, it's a way of doing things, it's a way of relating not to the natural system, but it is a way to relating as part of, from within the natural systems. We are a carbon-based life. We are carbon-based life forms. We are simply one of the multiple layers of biodiversity of the earth. We are not outside of the ecosystem. We are the ecosystem. Those are the key pivoting points from which we have to decolonize our language. We have to decolonize the framework by which we interpret this marvelous inheritance that we have, which is called indigenous agriculture.
All right. So, we're getting close here to the top of the hour. So I want to make sure that we do get to a couple of the live questions here. So I'm just going to start with one from Mr. Sanghi. He says, is there a role that science and genetic engineering plays in helping agroecology? Can GMO crops like drought-resistant crops exist in conjunction with agroecology permaculture principles?
Maybe since we have just done some work on this, maybe I can just quickly comment on this. If you look at, for example, the European Agroecological Association, they have their clear standpoints on these points of views. And I think they do agree that biotechnology in general is an accepted principle within agroecology when we look at it from a scientific point of view. I just want to reiterate on a point that I made earlier. I do think these technologies per se, when we talk about genome editing, CRISPR-Cas, I think they play a very important role to improve resilience of systems, and I think we can all benefit from these technologies. The important point is that we make sure it is actually an enabling technology. It's an enabling technology for everybody involved in these farming systems. And for this, it's very important that we talk, that we understand, the perspectives of people. Do they want these technologies on their land? Do they actually think they make a difference for them? They are useful for their farming strategies, for their goals. And then be very clear about power relationships. Is it these large agricultural companies that actually maintain the patents of these new varieties that are brought into the fields, or is it something that is accessible to the farmers and they can manage in a way that they see fit? I think in general, I think we have to be open for discussion and include everybody on the table, on that discussion table, to see whether these biotechnologies can be of use.
And I'd add, I think this is actually where journalism can either be helpful or harmful, or has played either a positive role or not a positive role. And that so much of the reporting, certainly in the US, that we have seen about genetic engineering has taken at face value the promises from industry. So we had reporting in this country in the late 90s saying that genetic engineering was going to help address vitamin A deficiency. We had reporting saying that genetic engineering was going to help with flood resistance and drought resilience. When, if you actually talk to scientists who were looking at the practices of genetic engineering, those qualities, drought resilience, flood resistance, those are highly complex qualities of a plant, and the kinds of technologies we are seeing from genetic engineering simply do not match that complexity. So what we see in the marketplace today is basically 100% of all genetic engineering is either genetically engineering a crop to resist a chemical pesticide or express an insecticide to deal with pests. I mean, that is pretty much, there are some marginal crops here and there, but that's pretty much what we see today. And so when we report on technologies, I think it is really important that you, as Thomas was saying, that we talk about the power behind the story of technology. And I was just reading one of my favorite writers about technology, Langdon Winner. I don't know how many of you have read his work, but he has this famous essay I recommend everybody who's reporting on technology to read. It's called The Whale and the Reactor. And he says this, and I'll end with this note. He says, technologies embody specific forms of power and authority. There is an ongoing social process in which scientific knowledge, technological innovation, and corporate profit reinforce each other in deeply entrenched patterns that bear the unmistakable stamp of political and economic power. And so when we are talking about technologies in agriculture, we cannot, as reporters, as writers, storytellers, as advocates, not disconnect those technologies from power. And the story of power in agriculture today is one of an incredibly consolidated marketplace in the chemical and seed industry and in the other inputs that are driving a specific kind of agriculture, including genetic engineering.
Amazing. I'm going to get to this next question here. It's from an anonymous attendee. It says, thanks everyone for your advice. Really appreciate your thoughts, Regi. Are there any networks journalists can tap into to find farmers leading in agroforestry? And how do we expand our definition of experts who can speak to agroforestry? For example, finding sources beyond Western science.
Again, I will refer to Regeneration International because that's where we have been trying to consolidate all of the requests and all of the networks we are in touch with. We, by no means, that's the unexhaustive list, but to the extent that we continue to expand that, we'll be putting those resources out there on that website. And Anna was putting a lot of links, and all of those links will have resources as well. They are very extensive, not just a single shot. As far as finding more, here's one thing. I recently saw a index of regenerative operations that was put out by a friend. In fact, I wouldn't say the name, but here's what happened. I looked through it, and their criteria on which they defined who reached the index was whether they had regenerative in their name or their claims. And of course, they ended up with about 50% corporations, with a lot of NGOs and so on. And they classified them. They did a good job on that part. But I didn't see a single a single mention of much more powerful stories that we already have on Regeneration International, because most of the actual regenerators on the planet, they don't use that word. Most of them are talking about agroecology. They are talking about indigenous agriculture, native agriculture, like somewhere in the southwest of the US and all of that. So they missed probably 95% of all of the good stories out there. So the keywords you use are central to what you're going to find. And yes, we can give you a lot of information here, but it's better if you communicate with us directly, because this is kind of a lot of pressure here. I can't think beyond the immediate top of mind, but we do have resources across Latin America, indigenous organizations. For example, did you know that British Columbia, most of British Columbia was never ceded to the crown, that it was never actually officially conquered, and that they restructured the indigenous or regional ancestral governments in that region, and it took them 10 years to actually reclaim that space? I mean, those stories are never gonna show up in these indexes because they are not convenient for the forces that dominate everything Anna has been talking about, and so on. I mean, all of those powers, those structures, those systems in place, they have a sneaky way of penetrating our psychic and further colonizing our minds and the frameworks by which we see the world. We have to escape that if we are going to make a difference with the words that we use to tell the stories that matter.
Really quick, I just want to share a comment. This isn't actually a question, but it came in from someone from Indonesia saying that they say in Indonesia to change farmers' beliefs are not easy due to the habit of using chemical fertilizers and pesticides. And on the other hand, the government never gives incentives to those who are doing organic agriculture. The traditional farmer has to rely on the experience they have. If nobody is succeeding in growing eco-friendly food, then there's no one to share success stories. So he's saying here, I think we should make an agroecology wiki so that most of this information could be collected and shared easily. I thought that was a really cool comment and something that would be really useful.
Go for it. I'll be contributing everything I got into that wiki.
Excellent idea. I also like this a lot, having worked in Indonesia for quite a while, and I think coming from Indonesia for Indonesia, that would be phenomenal to inspire people to do something different. Strong support.
And I wanted to address this question. This actually ties into a question I didn't get to ask during the panel. It's from Deborah. Deborah saying, hi, I would like to know if the urban agroecology projects and policies can be contemplating, sorry, I'm having trouble reading this. I believe she's asking about urban agroecology projects. How can journalists cover those? What do you all have to share on that front?
I jump into, oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I do think that you know, considering the urban space is extremely important, given that about 60% of the world population by 2030 will live in urban cities, and also that for a city of the size where I'm living now here in Hangzhou in China, about 10 million people, the average daily food demand is about 6,000 tons. So you know, that's quite a bit. I think there's some important initiatives. So for instance, in Europe, there's these Cities for Agroecology initiative that has very rigorous criteria promoting local production, processing and consumption of organic foods. You know, you have all these parameters of basically facilitating ecosystem services, improving water quality, soil fertility, organic matter cycling, and so on. So I think this was actually a network, the Cities for Agroecology, that has been scaling quite a bit in Europe. And there's you know, when I visited Berlin the last time, it's amazing to see in the city like all these small scale initiatives that just pop up on vegetative spaces all over the city, and how people start creating their own food corps and producing their own organic foods and kind of use that to support the livelihoods in the city. It's I think it's a movement that is incredibly important that it spreads, given the increasing demand for food in the urban space in the future.
And I was just going to jump in to say, when I heard that question, what came to mind is the incredible organizing that we've seen around the world, particularly, I mean, have been going on before COVID, but particularly during COVID, of really connecting urban consumers with food producers. And I mentioned at the top of the conversation that agroecology really is about shifting power, and that includes both to food producers and those people consuming the food to make those connections more direct and not have the artificial separation that so often happens in a kind of corporate food system. And so I was thinking about last year, in the wake of the beginning of COVID-19, the Agroecology Fund moved a number of grants to a lot of these mutual aid groups that were working, connecting agroecological farmers with consumers. And so there's both the agroecology that is actually happening in urban places that you described, Thomas, and there is the work that is part of the agroecology movement to connect people living in cities with those growing food, to unite them and really see their shared, their common cause.
Wow. Quick point. There are 3 places where energy is transformed at a mass scale at a planetary level: photosynthesis, the actions of animals through chewing mechanisms and the digestive tracts, and the biological, micro and macro biological systems of the soil. Those are the 3 places where most of the energy is transformed from CO2, methane in the air, through molecular structures that serve, cellulosic structures that serve as fodder for animals, that then is churned again. Think of it this way: if you take a pile of or a bunch of grass and put it in a compost pile, it will take you a year before it's soil. And in less than 72 hours or 2-3 days, a cow or a chicken or a pig can turn that into completely absorbable nutrients for plants, that they can turn it back into more energy and more energy. That level at which we squander the natural systems by interfering and disrupting them is so massive, especially when we interfere on those 3 levels. So agroecology addresses those 3 levels partially. But here's the thing about urban and the urban myth that there is such a thing as urban agriculture. What we have to understand is that in the urban context, we have already disrupted all 3 of the fundamental principles on which the biophysics and the chemistry operate on that ecospherical level. So the ecology is already disrupted to such an extent that what we need to focus on isn't about food production in the city. We need to focus on growing things and reconnecting and building culture, not production of food. Production of food is a mechanism, is a strategy, as a way to reconnect and to reestablish this connection with food. But the true sources of our food, as long as we are not manufacturing it in labs, it's going to be the landscape and the people who love to be in the land and who are willing to participate with those in the urban sectors to create the symbiotic connections that can allow us all to have access to affordable, healthy foods. That is at the end how this needs to work. And then understanding that when we engage in that, and I have been promoting community gardens, and we have been doing that too, but not with the illusion that we're going to produce food. Some stuff we will eat, but we haven't even measured how much pollution we're actually eating because of the intensity and the higher concentration and of those especially heavy metals in the urban areas, and how we are maybe putting that through our bodies. And there is no standards that actually exist for evaluating that. But there is enough research in the cities to know that even pigeons, for example, in New York, are different colors, those that live in the city, the feathers, versus those who live outside of the city, because of the way they process heavy metals and the feather changes and all of that. Now, how do we know what we're doing to ourselves with growing food next to bus stations or to highways or any of that? We truly don't know that. So we need to think this through with critical eyes, and more from a true understanding of the thermodynamics of the earth and how we are supposed to interact with those biophysical and chemical processes, and to what end do we plant things in the city and teach the children how to interact with those living systems, and then make sure we are evaluating the level of pollution. So if we shouldn't be eating them, just like we can't eat the fish from most of the lakes in Minnesota because of pollution, so we should also think about the same way about that lettuce, that tomato that is grown in a highly polluted environment. So think of that as we think of what are the pieces that in the angles and the language and the critical points that we need to be digging in when we tell stories like this, and don't just repeat what is being said. That's definitely central to this critical analysis.
All right, so we are approaching the end of the discussion here. I think we have time for just one more quick question, just real quick here. This person brought up something really good that I wanted to breach with you. They said, how do we scale such discussions from people with interests in this group, us that are interested in agroecology, to being more mainstream? How do we get all these topics to broaden?
I'll go first because I have no idea. And but I can tell you how we can scale, how we produce and deliver the food. Now you tell me how you scale, how you tell that story.
Yeah, I mean, I'll jump in. I think that how do we scale the story? I mean, I think that we're starting to see more of these stories actually getting out, and that is exciting to see. And I think the way that we continue to scale them is, I mean, it's through networks. It's through, I'm hoping many of you who've tuned in, it's through networks like Mongabay and other platforms. And you know, I was looking actually at the use of the term agroecology in the US, and I feel like you know, the baseline is such that the only way to go is up from here. I was looking at the New York Times. How many times has the word agroecology been used in the New York Times? And if we were in a room together, I'd have all of you guess. But so the number of times that the word has been used in the New York Times, just to use one, you know, mainstream publication as an example, is since 1984, just 22 times. But almost half of those, it was only used because it was in somebody's title because they worked at a center for agroecology. And then almost the rest of them, so almost the other half, were in op-eds or a letter to the editor or an editorial. And I thought that it was pretty funny that about a third of all of those 22 mentions came from just one person, Mark Bittman, and that there have been only 3 kind of substantive articles in the New York Times that have talked about agroecology, 2 about the power of agroecology in India to address hunger and public health impacts from pesticides there, and 1 just last month about the power of agroecological movements in Puerto Rico. So how do we scale this up? How do we get this term out there and the meaning behind that term out there? We obviously have a long way to go, but I think that I have taken heart in the fact that we actually are seeing, for instance, the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization actually has an approved 10 principles of agroecology and has integrated the term into a lot of the work they're doing. So progress is being made, but there's certainly a long way to go. And I hope you all can play a role in that.
Maybe I can also add one last word here. I do think you know, webinars like this are actually critical to scale this, and we have so many people here in the audience that now have more information at hand that can go out and ask questions. I think it's important to, from a scientist point of view, that you know, you should go out and also approach scientists and ask them questions. We oftentimes live in our ivory towers in the university offices, and I think it's very important that we have to talk about the things that we've learned. And I think it's important that everybody gets asked questions and engages in the discussions. And I think maybe a much more important point is because we do have to change our food systems, our agricultural systems, not in 10 years time. We really have to do that right now. I do think that you know, these initiatives, these questions, these suggestions from the gentleman here in Indonesia that just popped up, you know, how can we create a wiki for agroecology, and can people contribute, and can we scale these kind of little but very important initiatives? I think this is how this can scale, by the actions of people like yourselves, like every single individual can make that scale. And I think what we're doing here is incredibly important to actually make that happen.
Well, that is all the time we have for today. I just want to say thank you everyone who has given us questions and comments. You've all been a very interactive and lively audience. It was a pleasure moderating this discussion. On behalf of Mongabay, I'd like to thank the panelists for sharing their insight with us, and to everyone for joining us. We really hope that this was informative and helpful for you. A lot of people have been asking me if this is going to be recorded. Yes, it will. It will be up on our YouTube channel, so please make sure to follow Mongabay on YouTube, and you'll see it posted there. We'll also post a link on our blog on mongabay.org. And if you have any ideas that you want to pitch to Mongabay, you can do so at our opportunities page under mongabay.org under the heading Agroecology. So once again, I just wanted to say thank you to everybody. This was a joy, and you are all free to sign out of the webinar whenever you'd like. Thank you so much.